Oh, I'm okay about what Emmett said as long as he doesn't come after any of my donors. No, I'm just kidding. It's a great privilege to be part of a program highlighting Emmett's role in his here at IUPUI as the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation Visiting Chair on Community Foundations. So I'm really excited to be part of that, and he is a major figure in community foundations in America, and as you can hear, will soon be a major figure of community foundations throughout the world if he isn't already. There's an old saying that if you've seen one community foundation, you've seen one community foundation. And I think that's probably overstated because we certainly do have a lot of similarities. But each community foundation is shaped by local forces, traditions, values within that community. Certainly it's shaped by former leaders, both board leaders and executive leaders. So, and actually historical moments within that community itself. So we all kind of form out of the same idea, but our journey is different in many, many ways. And in fact, actually, the Community Foundation, I have the privilege of running the Central Indiana Community Foundation and the Indianapolis Foundation and the Legacy Fund of Hamilton County. That's actually been a lot of elasticity already. The Indianapolis Foundation was created in 1916, 2 years after the very first one in Cleveland. And in 1997, the Indianapolis Foundation joined together with the Legacy Fund of Hamilton County to create CICF. So right there, this idea that we were just going to be about Indianapolis changed drastically. And it was very controversial when it happened, and still has some elements of controversy to this day. It changed for a lot of reasons. Actually, the Indianapolis Foundation was really hamstrung by the fact that it was created as a charitable trust. And it had these legal resolutions of trust that really were starting to prohibit it from continuing to adapt and grow in a new era. And it was becoming less and less relevant in society. So it had to change. The Legacy Fund, which was one of the community foundations that was largely begun by the Lilly Endowment Gift Initiative in 1991, was kind of hitting the wall of being able to kind of sustain itself from operational funds. So, and then there was actually a donor services component, that we had a tremendous number of donors who lived in Hamilton County but worked in downtown Indianapolis or in Marion County. So who's going to serve them? Those donors have charitable interests in both counties. So by coming together through CICF, serving both and affiliating with the Legacy Fund of Hamilton County and the Indianapolis Foundation, donors won. We think both counties won. And there was an idea at the time of spreading that to the other surrounding counties, but kind of community politics, community fear, fear of change, kind of stopped that in its tracks. And I think that was fine, because we needed to kind of figure out how to make these two counties work together before you started to try to make 8 or 9 counties work together from a community foundation. But we've already seen that change here in Indiana and in Indianapolis. Let's see. So what began as this idea that we were focused on, the Indianapolis Foundation in 1916 was focused on Indianapolis. That actually was a law. That was part of the resolution of trust. That really couldn't be violated. But that actually has, over the years, over now 98 years, almost 99 years, that is actually part of our DNA. So what started as a law is now part of our very strong DNA about being local. And the way that we're structured is we have, the Indianapolis Foundation has $150 million, what we are now calling the Endowment for Indianapolis. And the Legacy Fund of Hamilton County has an $11 million endowment for Hamilton County. We also have a women's fund that has about a $11 million endowment for women and girls serving issues, but they're actually 9 counties, and actually can actually stretch beyond that if they wish, but they're really focused on 9 counties. So we have that money, and that's one of the things that we do. We're a grant-making organization locally out of those 3 funds to our community. And we really look at what we do, and we define it as we do three things as a community foundation. We are that grant maker. We are a grant-making organization. The second thing we do, and Emmett talked about this, with the emergence of donor-advised funds, we set up donor-advised funds, which we now internally and to our customers, our clients, our donors, refer to as personal foundations. And those are funds where legally the money is ours as a community foundation, but our moral obligation is to serve those donors philanthropy. Our job is to make their philanthropy more effective, more thoughtful, more meaningful, and more rewarding. So there's a double job there. It's try to make their philanthropy more effective in helping community and helping organizations, how they define community, and to make their sense of meaning about what it means for them and their family to be philanthropists. We want them to get the greatest amount of satisfaction and joy out of that. Now, as Emmett said, those gifts, those funds, which total for us about, out of our $720 million in assets, they probably total close to $400 million or more in those kinds of funds. So someone with a donor advised fund like that, they can give their money to any IRS recognized 501c3. Now I don't know about Emmett, it's probably a good question, maybe I'll ask him when he comes up here and to answer questions, is whether his international initiative, can they make, they've created the opportunity to make grants to international organizations that aren't even IRS recognized. And I'm thinking that they can. Yeah, and I'm getting a head nod there. So we don't do that. But anything, I mean, if one of our donors wants to give to an organization that builds schools in Africa, or the American Cancer Society, or a church in Pittsburgh, or their alumni, or their university in California, there are no restrictions against that. We serve them that way. But we did a study back in a couple of years ago, and we found that out of all those donor advised funds, 400 representing roughly about $400 million, 89% of all of their gifts stayed in central Indiana. And we were thrilled about that. We were thrilled about it. We didn't demand it, we didn't restrict them, but we were thrilled that such a high percentage stayed, having an effect on central Indiana. Now the third thing we do, so the first thing is a grant-making organization. The second is this kind of donor advising, donor counseling, donor support organization. And the third thing we do is we're a community leadership organization. We think that we have a special opportunity as a community foundation to have a very visionary entrepreneurial role about how to make Indianapolis and central Indiana better. We have this opportunity because of all the relationships we have. We're really a unique organization that we have relationships with all the sectors in the not-for-profit community, and we're pretty deep with all the sectors. No one else has the breadth and depth of relationships with the not-for-profits themselves that we do. The fact that we actually have all these donor relationships. I mean, you know, we all know in this community how great and how wonderful and how important Lilly Endowment is. But Lilly Endowment doesn't have 400 donor families they have a relationship with. We do. We think that gives us a special opportunity. Also, we don't have Lilly Endowment's challenge, and it is a very significant challenge with so much money, and it'd be interesting to see if Emmett's feeling like, as he's building the assets of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, whether they're going to run into this. But Lilly Endowment, with so much money, has to be concerned about, are they kind of abusing their power through their grant-making ability? $720 million, it's a good number, but we don't feel like we're restricted by the idea that our $50 million is going to be abusive in the marketplace. So we can actually be very proactive without that concern. So we're really focused on this entrepreneurial vision about how we can change the community. And we think we've been ahead of the field on that. We started that very kind of formally in 2005. So we've been doing it for about 10 years. The rest of the field that weren't doing it started to think that maybe they needed to, because community foundations always have to look at their relevance. Emmett mentioned value proposition. I would say there's not a week goes by that I don't think about, is our value proposition strong enough? Are we have to always focus on that. Because once we stop focusing on our value proposition to our stakeholders, we're sliding away into irrelevancy. So we're very focused on that. The rest of the Community Foundation was a few years behind us as a field in thinking that they need to stand for something. They can't just be a grant-making organization or a donor services. They actually need to have a vision for their community. So not every community foundation is going down that direction, but there's a whole sector-wide focus on helping community foundations to find more of an entrepreneurial visionary role. And we've done that by, we've basically put a stake in the ground that says, our number one belief for Indianapolis and central Indiana, what we think is important to our community is that for us to thrive in the 21st century, as a community, we have to do an outstanding job of developing, attracting, and retaining highly educated, creative, entrepreneurial, and community-minded people. Now, these days, most cities would talk about the first three, but we think there's something very special in Indianapolis, part of, again, of our community DNA, that we have this history, this value set of people being really community-minded, that they really have a passion about making our own community better. The way we talk about this, and it's, when I say we, it maybe started with us at CICF and Indianapolis Foundation, but I think the whole community talks about this, is if you want to be a consumer of culture, there are a lot of cities that are going to have a greater choice of cultural consumption than in central Indiana and Indianapolis. Certainly the Bay Area of San Francisco, greater San Francisco Bay Area, Boston, New York, Los Angeles. Those are going to have greater opportunities for cultural and entertainment consumption. But if you want to be a producer, if you want to get involved and make things happen that affects a community's quality of life, we think that this is the community, the number one community, where you can be welcomed in and fully engaged and introduced to all the people that you need to be introduced to make your creativity and your creative passion come to fruition. So that's kind of the way we look at it, and we think that that's something very special about central Indiana and Indianapolis. So when we look at our value proposition and our DNA and who we are in our own community, you know, we're very familiar with the other community foundations. We actually, Emmett and I will be heading to my hometown of San Diego in a few weeks for what's called the Larger Community Foundation Conference. It's about the 35 largest community foundations in the country. Emmett now represents the largest. We're about the 23rd, 24th largest. And so we really do compare notes. We look at best practices. We know what others are doing. And you know, we've looked at these other models. But for us, we believe that, you know, that we as a community foundation with this vision of making central Indiana forever better in very creative and entrepreneurial and visionary ways is the right match for our community. And I'll give you a couple examples about how we look at that. So if so we've decided that, you know, we're not really going to pursue trying to be the best community foundation for philanthropic transactions. You heard Emmett talk about the Kansas City Community Foundation and this Greater Horizons division that they've created to do philanthropic transactions all over the country and maybe all over the globe. They can do that. We're not interested in doing that. You know, Emmett's working on being a focus and a force for international philanthropy. We're not pursuing that. It's not our goal. We don't want to be that. We're not even focusing on being the largest community foundation. I mean, if someone wants to make us the largest community foundation, we'd be happy to talk to them. But that's not really the kinds of decisions that we're making. That was my 15 minutes, by the way, so I'm going to wrap up. And I'll give you an example of that. If a donor came to us today and said, look, I've been thinking about how to do my philanthropy. I've got two choices for you. I'll give you $50 million to I'll open up a fund with $50 million, but I really don't want your partnership. I want you to transact. I have 3 or 4 grants I'm going to give a year out of that $50 million. I just need you to transact them, invest the money, provide the back office. That's all I want. Or I could take a different approach, and I'm willing to, if you don't want to do that, I would give you $10 million, and I will be your partner. I will listen to your ideas. I will pay attention to your own community leadership initiatives, and I will give you every chance to pitch me on what you think is important, and maybe I'll come alongside and leverage my donations along with your donations in similar community efforts. Which one do you want? We would not hesitate. We would take the $10 million fund to have a local philanthropic partner who would help us make Indianapolis and Central Indiana even better than it is today.